I wanted to start off by saying that it's very tough talking about a notion of endurance in the backdrop of what's happening now in Sudan and, of course, in many other geographies. We are in the middle of a war, and so much of what we've known and grown up to understand as our physical environment or built environment has kind of ceased to exist now. So it's recently I've always kind of felt a certain, let's say, discomfort, but also, of course, a lot of notions of dislocation also with the concepts that I'm working on. But one concept or idea seems to kind of make sense more now than it ever did, which is a need or an urgency now for space to be opened up as a political discourse, and to really do the work of trying to speak of space discursively, and echo what Anna just said about it. Once we talk about architectures and infrastructure, it doesn't necessarily mean or have to mean that it is specifically matter, but really it is the carriers of some of the genealogy, residue of colonial legacies, and so on and so forth. So, and that is it's very easy to say it like that, but it's really difficult to articulate what that actually is. And I think that's where a lot of my work has kind of been committed to. There has been a kind of affirmation, especially with what is happening now in Sudan, and particularly in Khartoum, which is where I'm from, with regards to this notion of emptying. And today, especially, that we speak of colonial endurances and infrastructural violence, we speak of emptying that is ecological and also physical. So it's processes of demolition that are also at the same time processes of building something else and reconstituting new, let's say, functions and meanings in our environment that actually remove us, let's say, from the equation. And so we become, let's say, confronted with a question about inhabiting. How do you inhabit something that demolishes and kind of leaves you out of it all the time, right? So demolishes, offers you, let's say, demolition and desolation, but still kind of continues to build in a strange way. So one of the discomforts that I've always felt was looking at certain, let's say, codes of existing, things that I've noticed also generationally, experiences that my mother, my grandmother have also kind of gone through under the nation state, right? One being war, one being economic crashes and catastrophes, another being poverty or, restrictions in resources, and then, of course, the condition of being being an immigrant, right? Having to be part of a diaspora, having to leave, let's say, the geography that makes you, has been part and parcel of making you who you are, right? But also it is where you're mainly informed about how you reflect certain political aspirations and desires for yourself onto the surrounding. So when that particular set of meanings kind of disappears, it becomes almost like something has intercepted your connection to surrounding, or your capacity to connect to surroundings in a way where there is there's a way to render certain value onto your surrounding, onto the built environment, and also, of course, a way to inform how you create built form itself. For today, I thought I'll just meander through certain images to kind of reflect on also what I saw from the concept of colonial endurance in the exhibition, and then come back to an idea that I'm offering about a position maybe that we can take in our practices that can help push for the need and urgency to articulate space further, right? So first image here is from Sudan's records, and it's an image also taken by British officers stationed in various parts of Sudan. But this was one key image that I always kind of go back to, because it's an image that kind of marked this sort of epoch of when a particular environment is sort of rendered obsolete, right? Or rendered like at the cusp of becoming something different that doesn't sort of register anywhere but for the people who created this idea of it being an early road. Oops. The same image and same angle that was found in this records showed that this is what was classified as a modern road, and it showed, of course, the same greenery after it was kind of paved, a road or sort of early signs of quote-unquote infrastructure of urbanization, right? And I always find these two images very striking, because it was just literally that easy to call something an early road and a modern road, and for things to kind of really shift that way, and have a direct impact in our material or our environment. So I thought that my aim here is not to be entirely comprehensive. I kind of sometimes get tired of the rationalization that goes into theorizing and setting up critical, stances. But I wanted to sort of move along into these locations presented by the images, and ideas, and maybe also timeframes of the situatedness of some of the projects also. And I wanted through that to really highlight this geography of the discomfort that I had. And I thought that discomfort and kind of this correlation that I saw between processes of building and creating built form and actually inhabiting has become kind of it plays a significant role in sort of drawing alternative principles of spatialization in colonial urbanscapes. And I bring forth a statement that Dion Brand had made in a beautiful lecture called Cartography Equals Catastrophe. And she says, if I escape a tunnel of time, will I still survive? Or will I be part of shattered language groups in order to funnel down to an individual unit of capital? Spatial matters in this are inherently temporal matters. And I brought up, of course, the notion of time, also given the context of looking back at what certain stages of modernity has done to certain geographies. But I wanted to think about spatial matters from the perspective of time. And if, for example, we can read time differently in maybe even a third perspective when we're doing critical spatial work. And will that be the way to sort of trouble or escape linearity, as Dion Brand suggests? To be able to also take on positions and perspectives that would offer us, let's say, possibilities that are registered on different, let's say, terrains. And one, with this image, looking at this archival material, one moment was this notion of emptying. One thing basically that comes about and makes me remember basically what building infrastructure through coloniality actually did to certain geographies. I started to look at what ecological emptying would mean, at least reflect on also what it is in my own experiences. And one was when we had to immigrate, my family and I started to look at how the Khartoum was still quite, expanding as people were leaving and people were sort of existing in this state of economic crash, a lot of political disruption. Roads were still being built, buildings were being erected, and it really created this correlation between, or let's say affirmed the correlation between the process of building and a status of catastrophe. And it became very clear to me early on that it's the process of building basically offers up architecture as a carrier and a continuum for catastrophe and for the creation of uninhabitability. So questions of how do we inhabit something that is going to sort of go into catastrophe or is actually maintaining it makes us, it's a very sort of jarring kind of idea, especially when you see that the environment is becoming different, so it carries different signifiers, right? It carries different shapes, aesthetics, even the knowledge around it, of course, and its production, knowledge around its critique and production also changes, but yet the same thing kind of is reproduced. And we are, of course, also, as practitioners in it, sometimes, of course, quite complacent in reproduction and co-production of that. So, I moved into highlighting a site of catastrophe just so that I can kind of offer up a small little case study, given the time. I situated my grandmother's house as a site of catastrophe. My grandmother's house is in the middle of a Jazeera scheme, which is one of the biggest agricultural schemes in North Africa. And it was dubbed the basket of the world for a while. This house is currently experiencing severe cracking and is basically built on a soil that is greatly destabilized because of the irrigation systems that has been used. The soil is basically water has been seeping through the soil through the duration of the inception of the Jazeera scheme. And we're talking about since 1922, so we're talking about century long. The foundation of this house is now barely, it's on a cavity, right? It's on an empty space and parts of this, an empty sort of pocket of air, and parts of it is filling with water, right? And so there is, on the one hand, of course, the walls that are cracking of this house, But the house, of course, now is rendered uninhabitable. And that's why it also, of course, reads into what I've been looking into as the work of catastrophe, at least for me, is what is the spatial work that catastrophe actually does, right? What does it organize? How does it move people around? And of course, we know يعني, as spatial practitioners يعني, that is kind of extended or assigned to the process of urbanization. And so the notion of catastrophe isn't really kind of integrated so much into spatial organization. But this house now is uninhabitable. However, this house is now, under that condition of uninhabitability, is sheltering a big portion of my family from who had to flee Khartoum and come to stay in this building, which is in the middle of the Jazeera scheme, which is south of Khartoum. There was something about the cracks that you see on the walls, but also you see on the ground, that also offered up itself as also this infrastructure of violence, right? It was something that was a carrier of that violence, of course, because the building is falling apart, you know, when you see the crack and you see the foundational crack. So it's also something that's coming from underneath the soil, all the way up to, you know, the whole structure, or what is above the soil, that, you know, gives itself up to becoming, let's say, a signifier, a way of reading, maybe, or a way of watching and listening to what type of mechanism, you know, that shows, or let's say, defines a catastrophe, you know, as it's doing its work, let's say. So the fact that the family's all sort of staying there in a state of something that is about to fall brought me to thinking about this notion of debris and ruins, which is always, you know, in literature also, of course, spoken of as what is, you know, in today's world as the kind of properties of the colonial legacy, that it's in ruins and it has kind of finished or ended. But ruins are, let's say, the embodiment of a lot of the paradoxes that face us when we want to answer the question of inhabiting something uninhabitable, right? What does it mean to sort of look at colonial legacies through ruins, through debris, through notions of like excess, like the excess of water that destabilized the soil underneath my grandma's house? How to read things when, for example, excess of water, you know, that it could be something that is, and in the situation of the Jazeera scheme, it is something that is for irrigation, something that is supposed to, you know, you grow crops, you build capital, and it's huge resource. And yet at the same time, of course, it has this twofold of excess being also emptying. So driving people away from geographies in which they inhabited, they've built lives, they've created certain, let's say, social networks of reflecting meaning into their environment and so on and so forth. So this is the ecological emptying also that I kind of refer to, is that it's in the same matter, right? And then it's in the same mechanism that gives, that promises development, that promises progress, that promises wealth accumulation, and so on and so forth. So as, you know, the house kind of continues to fall apart, and mind you, this house is also within the same time frame as the establishment of the Jazeera scheme itself. So it makes you wonder and look at what the temporality that's inherent in spatial matter also means. That there's been something happening at the same period of time where something was built, and these irrigation channels for the Jazeera project has been kind of operative, that what makes you ask what actually was going on? What does the temporality hold? And what was going on while the water was seeping into the clay, right? This project around this house is titled "Tell the Waters What the Clay Kept Secret." And it's really a kind of invitation, or sometimes I call it offering, and sometimes it's a rant, to really try to understand what, again, what the spatial work of catastrophe actually is. And what happened in that almost century included, of course, external forces at play that moved certain people from the house, brought in certain people. You know, my uncles moving away to work in Saudi Arabia, some of their children being kind of raised far apart from them, and all of these external factors that also the house has witnessed, and these cracks have also witnessed. This time period where the water was slowly seeping into the soil relates also to this notion of endurance, right? And when I say endurance, I don't mean what particularly the families went through or the inhabitants of the houses went through, but endurance in the sense that things are kind of stretched to the max with the kind of definitive outcome of demolition and ruin, right? And so how do we really set up, let's say, take on positions in our practices that are critical towards something that has a kind of very fixed outcome like that? And where do people sort of, who do people sort of go to also ask for restituting things that are going to be sort of gone, right? And in the kind of works of research, artistic research for this project, I started to focus on the question of like, okay, if things are uninhabitable, and this is kind of what we're promised, to whom do you take your grievances to, right? This question of like, where can this be restituted? You know, is there any sort of reparative value in something that is in the process of its kind of demise, right? And this is not to be doom and gloom about it, but really there is a disappearance of things, and a removal and an exclusion of certain ways of being, right? And they seem to all kind of have this sort of stamp of expiration, right? So how do you build around notions of life that are premised on things like this, on expulsions and exclusions? And I started to think about the position I was in, which is this sort of correlation I find between built form and catastrophe. And I started to think about the topography and the type of architecture that was built around the Jazeera scheme itself. Mainly, of course, it's water control architecture. So dams, canals, groves in the water, and they followed primarily gravity-based irrigation system. So the slope became something that you see everywhere, right? The inclination, everything that was 2% inclined seemed to make up most of what was the noticeable and pronounced form of the area. And so I started to think about, okay, what kind of spatial vocabulary we can build from looking into these sites of catastrophe kind of deeply and intimately, and having to be committed to look at sites that also you've kind of inhabited as well, right? What does that, what's the potential in that? And so the slope became this vocabulary of element that was really, am I okay with time? I'm just wondering. Yeah? Okay. So the slope became something that is really crucial, or something that was kind of offering itself as a start of certain vocabulary and literacy around built form and what it does, and this notion of the work of the work of catastrophe, right? The spatial work of catastrophe. So slopes became things that seemed important and seemed central to a notion of looking at that particular site. I incorporated, and I think just because of time, I wanted to incorporate parts, and this is just a first stage of experimenting with this work and with this research, is introducing this spatial element, and of course introducing along with it the different mechanisms by which people or the inhabitants of the house wanted to reflect meaning. So, there's a lot of let's say self-made, elements or matter, material, color codes that prevented certain diseases, like or repellents for mosquitoes, like the green gradients and so on and so forth. Just because of time, I think just to wrap it up, I'll just say that it's very, very important to look at also whose gaze and whose position is looking at a notion of infrastructural violence, right? Who's actually being impacted or affected, and who's also the answer to the question of inhabiting would actually benefit from getting an answer to that question. I think I'll stop now, and I thank you for coming today. Thank you very much for having me, and